Hey there. I wanted to take the time today to show you how I go about creating a brand new React Native project. I'm going to be creating this project as if I was starting a new project for a client. This architecture for the app works great for both small and large apps. We're going to be using dependencies. Three big ones include Redux, which helps manage our application state, Redux Saga, which helps manage asynchronous calls in our application state, and React Navigation, which allows us to navigate around the app easily. With these three libraries, we can get up and running with a great React Native app to help you get going on your next project. So let's go ahead and get started. One more thing before we jump in. This video is by no means a comprehensive, in-depth look at React Native, Redux, Redux Saga, or React Navigation. Each one of these could take up a series of videos on its own. I'm just going to show you everything you need to get up and running. And I'll be including documentation to all of these libraries in the description. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the pure React Native CLI to get up and going. But if you're familiar with Expo, you can use that as well. I just prefer sticking with the vanilla React Native CLI. So we're going to create a new React Native project by going npx React Native init, and then you enter your project name, hit enter, and you're going to let this install the dependencies it needs to create your new project. And once this finishes, we will dive into the next steps. So I'm going to run npm start, go into iOS, and importantly, I'm going to go ahead and now open up mobile app project.workspace. So once you've opened up Xcode, you're going to want to just click the play button, and this is going to go ahead and build your new project and launch a simulator to start it up. So we can see that our React Native project has launched and successfully installed on the simulator. Once you see a screen like this, you know that your installation has completed successfully, and we can move on to the next steps. Okay, so next up, we have to go ahead and install a few additional dependencies we're going to use in our project. So we're going to go npm install, and let me just go ahead and add first Redux. Redux is the state management library we're going to use to manage our application state. Then we have Redux Saga. Redux Saga is a library that helps work with asynchronous actions in a more Redux-friendly way. Next, we need something called React Redux, which helps to connect Redux up with our app. Let's go ahead and enter and let these install. Once this finishes, we need to go ahead and install React Navigation. I'm going to use React Navigation API version 4.0 because I think more developers are familiar with it. If you want to use 5.0, feel free, but for our use case, we need to go ahead and install a few dependencies for React Navigation. Go ahead and let this finish installing. Lastly, once this finishes installing, we need to do one more thing. We need to cd into iOS and do pod install. You need to make sure you have CocoaPods installed, of course, but what this is going to do is integrate the dependencies we need into pods for Xcode. Okay, so we've managed to start our project up and install all the dependencies we're going to need on the React Native side. So let's go ahead and start setting up the project. So I'm going to go ahead and open the root directory inside of a text editor. I'm just using VS Code here. And I'm going to go ahead and show you kind of the directory structure that I like to use when creating a new project. Feel free to make modifications to this as you see fit. So for starters, I'm going to go ahead and create a new directory and just call it app. This is where all of the files and directories for the actual app are going to reside. And with that note, you could also go ahead and create a folder at the root level, and I'll call it assets. And this is where I would include anything like custom images or fonts. Okay, so with the app directory created, we're going to go ahead and first set up Redux in the application. Redux is the underlying state management software we're going to be using. I'm going to create a new folder called models, and this folder will hold all content related to Redux and anything we do with state, holding, or interacting with data in our app will live in the models directory. Now, after we've created the models directory, I'm going to create a file in there, and I'm going to call this the root reducer, and this is going to be the top level reducer we use for Redux. And traditionally, I would create a new folder for each type of data I'm working with in the application. So in this application, we're just going to walk through an example with working with user data. And for example, if this was a blog application, I would create a new folder for each piece of data I'm working with. So maybe one for posts and maybe one for comments. Now in the user directory, I'm going to go ahead and create 3 more files: actions.js, sagas.js, and reducers.js. And I'm going to go into depth about what each of these files is doing later on. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and provide an initial state. For a user, maybe we'd have something like ID, name, and let's say an email. And we'll say that these all are null, and then we go ahead and set up a reducer, setting the state equal to our initial state we just defined, and then also taking in the incoming action. So within this reducer, we need to tell Redux how to handle the incoming action. So we do this by switching on the incoming action dot type. I'll go into detail about what this action looks like later, but essentially it has two components, one of which is the type, which is really just a named constant, and the other is the payload, which is the information that we're going to use to update the state. And lastly, just be sure that you export this reducer, which we'll need later on. And next, we need to actually define this action that we're switching on. So let's go ahead and jump into our actions.js file and do that. And here, we're going to define all of the actions that can happen to our data. So let's say, for example, we'll walk through when the application starts and we want to acquire the data from the logged in user. We're going to have to request the API to return such information. So let's call this get all user info request. And I like to add requests to all actions that are going to be reaching out to an external server, because that way, maybe down the line, you could use regex or something to check to see if an action is a request, then show a loading spinner, for example. So the way I like to look at it is that each action can have a corresponding success or failure action that you're going to want to handle later. So I have some auto formatting going on there, and I'm just going to go ahead and export these. All right, so now that we have our action set up, let's go ahead and go back into our reducers file. And now in here, we can actually switch on the action.type. So we're going to act as if we have a incoming action.type that's equal to get all user info request success. And we'll see where we would actually dispatch such action later. But for now, let's handle it. So when we do dispatch an action, we're going to be getting an ID, name, and email back in the action.payload. And we'll take a closer look at how this is structured and how this works later. But for now, just follow along and we'll return the ID, name, and email here. And what this does is it replaces the current state with the new incoming state with these properties that we're taking from the payload. And of course, you could also switch on get all user info request failure and just the actual request if there's something you had to do to the state. But for now, this should be sufficient. So there's one more thing that you want to do in all of your reducers, and that's set up a default case. And in this case, we just want to return the state as is. We don't want to make any modifications if an incoming action doesn't match any of the ones that we set up here. With this first reducer set up, let's go ahead and set up our root reducer. So this is essentially what's going to combine all of the reducers we have for each individual model. One for the user, one for the posts, one for comments, and so on. So to start, let's import combine reducers from Redux. So then I'm going to go ahead and import the reducer that we just created. I'm going to call it user reducer. And this is coming from user reducers. Now we're going to go ahead and create the root reducer. We're going to use the combine reducer function from the Redux dependency. And then we're going to combine and essentially give each one a name. So we'll call this one user reducer. And then lastly, just export this reducer, which we're going to be using in a second. So now that we've set up this root reducer, we're going to go ahead and set up the Saga using Redux Saga, and this is what handles all of our asynchronous actions. I like to have a separate reducer, set of sagas and actions for each different type of model. And obviously with the reducers, we'll combine it here, and then we're going to go ahead and combine the sagas all together later on. Let's go ahead and set up one more file. In the root of our project, we'll create one called store.js. And this is where we're going to connect and create our store and all of our sagas together. But before we do that, let's go ahead and create an example saga. So let's go ahead and start with our imports. We need to import a function called takeEvery from Redux Saga /effects. And then we'll import this action that I said we'd use earlier, get all user info request. We're going to see how this ties together in this file from .actions. So first, let's set up what I call a handler. Every Saga will have this function at the top, and this is also a generator function, so include this asterisk up here. And in here, we're going to call yield, because this is a generator function. This is how Redux Saga works under the hood. It uses generator functions. We're going to call the take every function we imported, and we're going to pass in the action and the corresponding function we should call when this action is received. So in the handler, we'd have a yield take every for every single different action that we want to handle asynchronously. So for example, when we dispatch an action, get all user info requests from somewhere in the app, which we'll do later on, we want to make sure we call this function get all user info. So let's go ahead and set up that function. This is also a generator function that takes in the action. It gets passed automatically. And to start, I like to wrap all of my asynchronous calls into a try catch block. And here, obviously you would handle your error, maybe show an error pop-up, however you'd like to handle that, something more graceful than just crashing the app. And in the try block, this is where we actually make the API call. Lastly, let's go down and just export the handler. This is the important part of the file that we will need. Now that we're exporting our handler, we can set up our store. So let's go back into store.js and create our Redux store and connect our Saga middleware. We need to set up some imports.
From Redux, the first being create store, and the next apply middleware. These are both from Redux. And then we're going to go ahead and import create Saga middleware. And this is a default export from Redux Saga. Alright, so now let's go ahead and create the Saga middleware. Using the create Saga middleware function. So we're going to import reducer. This is the root reducer that we created earlier. So app models root reducer. Great. So now that we have these two pieces, the collective store of all of our models and all of the Saga middlewares, in this case, we're only going to have one. So let's go ahead and import it now. So I'll import handler as user Saga. Models. You would have a different Saga import for each model you have. For reducers, we only have one import because, as you recall, we've already combined them all into one. So now that we've imported everything, go ahead and create store. And we're going to pass in the root reducer as our first function. And then we're going to call apply middleware and call Saga middleware here. And then lastly, we have to tell the Saga middleware to run each of our Sagas that we've imported. And then lastly, we'll go ahead and export the store. You don't have to export the store, but sometimes you may need it in places in your application, so I like to just do it here. Okay, so we've actually done quite a lot, but now we need to tell our app about the work we've done with Redux and Redux Saga. In order to do this, I'm going to go ahead and open up app.js in our root directory, and by default we have this filler content. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of it.
Let's go ahead and remove this TypeScript declaration down here. We don't need that. Then we can import the things we do need, or React. Then we import our store, which we've just set up. Next, we'll import something called a provider, and this is from the dependency we saw at the beginning called React Redux, which will connect our app up. So in here, we can return provider, which is just its own JSX tag, and provide in the store itself. Now what we're actually going to do next is pass in another component between the provider, which will act as the root of our app. In order to do that, in app folder, I will create a new file called index.js.
Before we go ahead and set up the index.js file, it's important that we first set up React navigation. In order to do that, I'm first going to go ahead and create a new folder in the app directory, and I'll call it utils. Utils is the folder where I'd keep anything utility related, something that really doesn't belong in any of the other folders. In utils, I'm going to go ahead and create router.js.
So we're going to go ahead and start with importing a few things. First, create stack navigator from React navigation stack. And then we'll go ahead and import create app container React navigation. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create a stack. A stack is just one of the many ways that you can build your screens in React navigation. It works similar to the stack data structure where new screens get pushed to the top, and as the user swipes back, screens are popped off the stack. So it maintains a history of your navigation. So we'll call this main stack and call create stack navigator. And here, this is where we pass in the actual screens in our app. And right now we don't have any, so let's take care of that. So in order to set up a screen in our app, I'll go ahead and create a sample screen. So in the app folder, I like to separate out each one of my screens into a different folder. That way I can separate the business logic and components associated with each one. So we'll go ahead and create a folder. I'll call it home because this will be the home screen. And in here, I'm going to create a file called index.js. So we need to import React from React. I'll import a view because we'll just attach a view for now. If we need to add some text or something later, we'll do so. And call it home, pass in the props, and then we'll just simply return a empty view here, and we'll export out from here. In this folder, I would actually create another folder called components. This is where I would create any components associated with this screen and attach them here. And in this index.js file, this is where I would just create functions related to querying the API, dispatching actions, or talking to Redux. We're going to do that in here. Let's go back into our router.js file, and we can add it to the stack navigator. So create stack navigator takes an object. Inside of this, you add a key for each screen, and the value is another object where you specify the actual screen and the component. So this screen will be called home, and it's associated with this screen with home component, which we need to go ahead and import up here. And lastly, we'll create a constant called navigation and called create app container and pass in our main stack. React navigation does some stuff behind the hood to configure the stack navigator, and then we can go ahead and actually export navigation. So additionally, there's a plethora of other options that you can pass into this create stack navigator to configure it. We can finish our index.js file in the app directory, which the app.js file will need. So this is where we actually include React navigation in our project. So we'll go ahead and import React, import a view. We're going to go ahead and actually import the navigation that we just created from the router. App constant here, and we're just going to return some JSX here. So we'll have a view, and I'll give it a style because this will be our root view, and we want the navigation to take up the entire screen. So I'll say flex1, which takes up the entire space, and flex direction, I'll make sure this is set to column. So inside our view here, we can now pass in the navigation. Obviously, we'll have to export the app as well. So this is great. Now we are actually including the navigation that we set up in the router file in a component, and we can go ahead and attach this to our app.js. We just need to go ahead and actually add a /index here to our app import. Once we do that, we should be good to go. And we can actually start up our project and make sure everything is working. So I'll go ahead and close out all my folders, minimize them, and I'll just run npm start. In Xcode, I'll launch my simulator, go ahead and start on iPhone 11, and it looks like we can see our project, which is great. So this is the home screen we set up. React navigation sets up a little default bar at the top here. So now that we've set everything up in the app, I'm going to go ahead and show you very quickly how we can actually use Redux and Redux Saga to query API, load data into a component, and use the navigation from React Navigation. I want to actually display on our home screen page this ID, name, and email. Right now it's set to null, but let's say, for example, we'll pull this information from our backend API. I want to be able to display it on the front end of our app. So how do we take the information from the Redux store and actually incorporate it into a component? Well, let's go ahead and do that. So first we need to define two different constants, and the first one is called map state to props, and it takes two parameters, state and props, we have access to our state from our Redux store, and we can return from this function in order to pass props to our component. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and take the ID, name, and email from the state dot. Remember, in our root reducer, we defined the user reducer as just user. So we'll pull it from state dot user, turn this directly. So now we're pulling the ID, name, and email from our state here in our user reducer, and we actually will have access to this in the component now. So I can pass an ID, name, and email here. Let's return a multi-line expression, and let's have a text string where put ID, just import text from React Native, because we actually need to tie this map state to props into our Redux store. And in order to do that, we need to import something called connect from React Redux. We've already used this library before. What we're going to do now, declare a new const, call the connect function, and because we're going to call this home, we're going to call this component home view. Pass in home view here at the end. And connect takes two parameters, map state to props. The other one is the other constant that we need to define up here, and this is map dispatch to props. And it takes two parameters, dispatch and props. And this returns an object, which we'll see what it does in a second, but for now we can just leave it empty. We'll pass it in here as our second parameter. Okay, let's save this. So if we pull up the simulator after running our project, you can see we don't see anything yet, and that's because by default ID, name, and email are set to null. If we go ahead and change this to some default values, now we can see on our home screen this data is being displayed directly. We're pulling it from our reducer into our component, passing it from map state to props down to the component itself. So now you can really kind of see the real power that Redux has in our application as it manages to state directly while just passing down the information that we need directly to the component. So what is this map dispatch to props function that we define? This second argument to the connect function is similar to map state to props, but instead of mapping data from a reducer, we're going to map actions that we can dispatch in our component. So for example, if we have a button on our home screen, when we press it, we want to fetch new data to update this, and we want to call that, fetch new data from our API. That's what we can do in map dispatch to props. We already defined an action, get all user info request. So let's go ahead and define a function here, get all user info. Doesn't take any parameters, but we could pass in a parameter. So inside this function, we call the dispatch function that would get passed in. And this takes an object. First argument is the type. As we've seen before in our Saga, our handler responds to all actions of get all user info request and calls this function get all user info. So we're going to dispatch that same action. And additionally, we can pass in an optional payload. In the payload, this is where you'd pass in data. So for example, if we only wanted to get certain user IDs, user info, we could pass that in here. We'd have access to that in the actual handler function in the action.payload, but for now, we won't pass any parameters. So now this component actually has direct access to this function get all user info we defined, map dispatch to props, thanks to the connect function. In order to call this when the component renders, let's use effect. It'll run right when the component mounts, and we'll just call get all user info, which is a situation you might face in your app when you first load it up. You want to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information from the user that gets loaded into your Redux store. So we display the most recent information. So now just to show you that this function really is getting called, we can go into the Saga where we define the handler that responds to it, and let's go ahead and actually just log out the action here. So you can see we're logging out the action. There's no payload, but you can see the type user/get all user info request, and we're in this actual generator function here in our sagas.js file. This is where you would actually make your call to your backend API to get the information that you need, in this case, the user info. We're not going to go ahead and query an actual API now because we don't have one set up. That will be the topic of my next video. Let's just act as if we had just received data back and now we want to pass it into our Redux store. How would we go about doing that? We have a function that Redux Saga provides us with called put. I'll go ahead and import this. So put is very similar to the dispatch function we've already used in our component map dispatch to props. We're going to pass in an object and give it a type here. Now this time we're going to use getAllUserInfoRequest success because we're going to assume that this was a successful request to the backend, and we're going to provide a payload, and now we're going to actually pass in data. So we're going to use mock data now, but you could imagine if you got data back from your API, you'd pass it in here, and it would be dynamic data. Whenever this function gets called, it's going to dispatch this new action to Redux in our reducer, as we've already set up getAllUserInfoRequest success to switch on it and take the ID name and email from the payload, return it, and apply it to our state. So now that everything's wired up, we should see this new email, another test email at test.com, right? And then we would expect that because when this component renders, it calls getAllUserInfo, which dispatches the request. In the Saga, it calls getAllUserInfo, the generator function, and it just dispatches this mock data. And we see it on the home screen, so that's great. So next you may be wondering, how do we get access to React navigation at this point? Well, it's pretty simple. We just get navigation as a prop passed down. To prove that, I can console log navigation here. You can see it'll have all of the functions you'd expect. You could call navigation.navigate right in here, and it would work as you'd expect. And you'd pass in your screen name. So if you had a login screen, you do that here. We don't, so I'll comment it out. All right, so at this point we have a fully working React Native app that is using Redux to manage our state, Redux Saga to dispatch asynchronous actions, and React Navigation to move around. This is a very powerful app architecture which is very scalable and lets you do a lot of things very quickly. I'm also going to be including this project as a GitHub repo, and I'll put the link in the description, so feel free to check that out or clone it for your next project. In the next video, I'm going to expand this project and actually build out a backend so we can have a real working Node.js backend and dispatch real actions to it and get back real dynamic data. So if you'd like to see this video when it comes out, be sure to subscribe, and thanks for checking out the video.